Which button do I click to go forward? Top one.
I think to the right.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm James. Nice to meet you. I had a blue breezer. I think Austria to stick to its traditional beer, if I've got any opinion on this. I'm going to talk to you about the stablecoin endgame. So to start off, I want you to imagine you're doing the most important deal in your company of the year. And you have two bosses. And on Monday morning, the head of sales comes over to you and he says, you must do this deal. You must do this at all costs, get it done. An hour later, your second boss walks by, the head of legal, and he says, if you do this deal, you will crash the whole company. Do not do this deal. So what do? If you go against legal, you could crash the company. If you go against sales, you don't get the deal. I can now see who works in legal, because they're like, well, you should go with legal. In terms of that, you have inadvertently become the single point of failure. You can't please anybody, and you have to mess with somebody. You have to make an enemy of somebody. And this is what I think is exactly playing out in the stablecoin market. And I'm going to talk you through some of the models that I think will end up winning and some of the models that might not end up winning. And I would say it's not about technology, it's about compliance, liability, architecture. So if you walk away with anything from this talk, it's a new three-letter acronym I've made up, CLA, Compliance, Liability, Architecture. And why does it matter now? Because you've got all unities with Deutsche Bank, DWS, and Galaxy launching a Euro stablecoin together. You had 9 European banks announce they're forming a conglomerate to launch a stablecoin together as well. So they're starting to move in this direction as well. ECB came out saying in 2029 they'll have their CBDCs ready, but the market is not waiting for them. The market is moving at a very fast pace. And I think that's really key. And banks are no longer issuing tokens. I hope they're thinking about how their global compliance architecture will actually matter. It's okay for the moment when the market is just 400 billion or 300 billion, but when it's 4 trillion, there'll be a problem. So the question is this: which model wins? You've got crypto products, and you've got, I guess, CBDCs, crypto-native products, and you've got what I call the consortium model coming down the line. And I think this will have a big factor of which model wins and which model survives. And the hidden variable that I think no one is talking about is this. Because if you have a single issuer model, it's like taking, give you an example. A German car manufacturer sends $10 million to a semiconductor company in Singapore, and it's with a US stablecoin issued from the US. So now you've got 3 actors in the room, and the US says, freeze that. Singapore says, if you freeze that, that counts as theft in our world. And the Germans are like, you must process this payment. This US issuer has to go against either the US, has to go against Germany, or has to go against Singapore. It cannot please every single regulatory body across the globe. It would be the equivalent of one air tower controller trying to direct all of the planes against all of the different aerospace rules around the world. You would get planes falling out of the sky, in my opinion. So there's 4 endgame scenarios. There's CBDC dominance. This is moving quite slow. It has probably the lowest risk liability. They call the rules. You've got crypto native winners. Tether, Circle have all done a massive success, but they come from single issuers. So when it becomes a serious infrastructure that actually wants to settle on global settlement, you will find that they come a crop of the regulatory bodies that all want to freeze and what not to freeze. You've then got tech distributed. You had Libra, which failed because of regulatory stringency, but they're also walking into single issuer dominancy. The bank consortium, it could be any organization consortium, doesn't have to be a bank. Now this model, if you have this scenario with a bank consortium, the US looks after US compliance, Germany looks after German compliance, and Singapore looks after Singapore compliance. You have a distributed model that is resilient and doesn't have a single point of failure. And this is the model I think that will survive in the future. And I don't see many people talking about it. I don't see many people building this either. The scenario, I actually jumped ahead and gave it to you already. So this is where if you have that single issuer, they can't please anybody, and that's the message I'm trying to get across here. Concentrated compliance liability. This again is the perfect example I've got is the air traffic controller. You cannot control all of the aerospace around the world from one center. It's the same as if you had a passport control, but you try to get a visa for every country at exactly the same time. It does not work. What you need is local compliance with global scale. That is what makes the difference here. You've then got third-party counterparty risk. It's also really hard to insure and risk against a single issuer because you're not sure what they will do. A lot of the single issues currently have said, we will just follow the US rules. If the US freezes us, asks us to freeze it, we will freeze you. Tornado Cash was a good example of this, where people who just had dusted accounts were getting frozen in Europe, and the European user was not protected. So you don't have a lot of local compliance following the right rules. This is where this model that we're currently building is great to experiment with, but we are seeing very early steps of people coming towards a consortium model. A lot of people feel like they can win and take a monopoly on this, whereas I feel like the distributed, resilient model is the one that will play out. The infrastructure lesson here comes down to the internet. The internet, if you look at it, you've got many ISPs you can choose between. DNS has multiple implementations across one standard. You can move, the internet doesn't have an owner to it as well. So the infrastructure of you having a federated model creates more resilience. And this is where I feel we will see a lot of players going into, and where I see a big opportunity for people that want to step up and actually play this model as well. They can link banks across different jurisdictions, which ends up having a very resilient stablecoin model they can use. There is obviously things like clearing houses being built out that could actually swap them around, but I feel like the federated model still wins. In the upper quadrant, you've got CBDCs, but as I said, they're moving extremely slowly. Then you've got, who's in the bottom right? The bottom right is the consortium model, the green. So this is the mixed risk. This is the one I think is the best positioned to take a lot of the stablecoin market. If you have each bank or each enterprise looking after its own jurisdiction, there's a segregated risk. If that country goes to war, something happens, the model still continues. You just route around them at the moment. It's the same in traditional finance as well. You would route around them. These are 5 metrics which I spoke to Bluechip about earlier, and I was like, you don't do this. And thinking about it not from a reserve or technology basis, but actually thinking of what's our liability if we have freezable assets? Which country are these assets in? We might actually be dealing with a situation where we've never met the 2 parties that hold our stablecoin, but we have to get involved in this compliance issue. This causes a very big issue and a big headache. I can imagine it's almost impossible to deal with all of the different regulators. You've got MiCA, you've got the FMA, you've got Genius Act coming in, and you've got MAS in Singapore. There's a compliance headache if you can't deal with all of them and all of the changing rules as well. So these are 5 questions that I think people should be asking themselves about their stablecoin and their stablecoin architecture. So local enforcement, spoken about shared standards. You can have multiple implementations with shared standards. The UK actually yesterday just said they're going to follow the US rules. They actually said build with them, but let's be honest, they're just going to follow them. And that way the US and the UK won't have a lot of these issues. So there's some regulators are seeing this as well, but I definitely think if assets get frozen from the US in the UK, they'll relook at some of the situations and where they're actually being held captive. There's a real fragile rail risk that if countries do nothing, you have an issue that you'll end up using someone's rails and you're playing on their terms. So you can either go alone, as lots of banks are currently doing, lots more are coming that I know of that are coming as well. This isn't a bad model, and it may work that you can build some synergies, but you will face this problem once your stablecoin ends up in all parts of the different world that you weren't expecting to have to do compliance in. The federate model, which I think is the most promising model I've seen. The one in Europe is just with Europeans at the moment. I think they should branch out and start doing things with Singapore, Hong Kong, because that stablecoin, if they want it to proliferate and be used a lot, they'll need to have multiple different jurisdictions also doing compliance as well. The most dangerous thing, though, is to do nothing. If you do nothing, you'll definitely end up using somebody else's infrastructure. And using someone else's infrastructure is where you had the AWS outage last week. Nobody could do anything because you were frozen. You didn't have multiple implementations, and you were stuck until AWS fixed it. So this is where do nothing is probably the worst case scenario, I think, for banks at the moment. So conversations that we should be having. Rating agencies, Ben may disagree with me on these points, but I feel like this is an important subject that people aren't bringing to light enough. And if Circle manages to control US dollars all around the world, the US can freeze dollars anywhere they like at any time. And this puts a huge risk around the world, in my opinion. So, as I said, it won't be won by tech or distribution. It'll actually be won by compliance liability architecture. And that is one of the key things I don't see anybody discussing, probably because it's the least sexy thing you could possibly talk about on Twitter. And the actual risks involved, and it's a hard problem to solve, but the people that do solve it will find, I think, a moat that a lot of enterprises are interested in using, a lot of regulators are interested in using. The European Systemic Risk Board, if I've got that correct, came out with a paper on the 25th of October discussing these exact issues. They see a systemic risk in stablecoins if it's done from a global compliance perspective as well. Because all at the moment, a lot of the stablecoins have to follow the US rules, and this puts Europe at a huge disadvantage. That was my 25-minute presentation in 13 minutes.